This is the most analytical and theoretical part of the chapter where we talk about the labor theory of value. So, in economics, there are two theories of value. You have a labor theory of value and you have a utility theory of value. The labor theory of value states that the value of every commodity is determined by the amount of labor included in that commodity or used to produce that commodity. And this is an idea that Adam Smith talked about. David Ricardo agreed with Adam Smith, and then Marx builds upon David Ricardo. A lot of people describe Marx as a post-Ricardian or a Ricardian because what Marx does in his main economic book, which is called Capital, is to derive the ultimate conclusions of Ricardo's framework. So here for the labor theory of value, that's where we are going to see the unfolding of the ultimate conclusions of David Ricardo. So I'll repeat, the labor theory of value states that the value of every commodity is determined by the amount of labor used to produce that commodity. So that being said, Marx then go on to discuss the labor value, the value of the labor power. So we could say in a not extremely precise way, but that Marx is trying to say what determines the wages. How do we determine how much 1 hour of labor will be traded for a certain amount of commodities? And Marx will say, well, the value of labor power is determined just like any commodity by the amount of labor time necessary to produce labor. In other words, it's the amount of time necessary to produce the subsistence commodities like food, clothing, and other socially necessary commodities that the workers consume. So, for example, in our society, most people need to have a phone in order to produce and reproduce themselves as a worker. So, a phone would be part of this subsistence level. So, it's socially determined and changes over time. So, all right. So, that being said, Marx will go on and suppose that for 1 day's worth of food, clothing, housing, etc., regards the following amount of labor hours to produce. So we need 1 hour of labor time in order to produce enough food for the daily subsistence of the worker. Half an hour of labor time in order to produce 1 day worth of clothing for the subsistence of the worker, 2 hours of labor time for shelter, and 1.5 hours for other things. So in order to see how much is the value of labor power, we'll just sum up how many labor times, how much labor time is necessary to produce and reproduce the worker for the subsistence of the worker. And here, when we sum up all the labor times, we arrive at 5 labor hours. Okay, so the subsistence of the worker is equal 5 labor hours per day. All right, so then Marx goes on thinking about this idea, and he says, well, the workers go to the labor market and they sell their labor power for what is necessary for their subsistence. Remember, subsistence wages was an assumption that Both Adam Smith and Ricardo adopted, and so did Marx. So workers go and sell their labor power for 5 hours per day. Okay, but then the working shift is 8 hours long. So the worker produces 8 hours worth of stuff, but only receives 5 hours. The 3 hour differential is what Marx called the surplus labor or surplus value. Okay, so there is some leftover after the worker produce and reproduce him or herself. Then the big question is, if people are not receiving what they are contributing to production, are they being cheated? Okay, so what do you think?